What really happened on the day the music died? A small private plane took off around 1 a.m. and disappeared into the night sky. The pilot never radioed for help, and the aircraft impacted the ground just a few miles from the airport. There's just one name missing from this memorial, and that's why this is the story of the young pilot and the terrifying mistakes that killed Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and JP the Big Bopper Richardson. My name is Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. In order to understand how the passengers ended up on the plane that fateful night, we have to begin our story in January 1959, just a few weeks before the crash. Rock and roll music was just beginning to become very popular in the late 1950s, and the 22-year-old Buddy Holly was at the forefront of it all. Now, some would argue that he remains to this day the single most influential creative force in the history of rock and roll. And as part of his rise to fame, on January 23, 1959, he joined several other musicians on a 24-day winter dance party tour across the Midwest. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned, as the artist would nickname this the Tour from Hell, and it was destined to become one of the most infamous tours in rock and roll history. As you can see from the image showing the tour stops, there was no rhyme or reason to how the shows were being scheduled, as the musicians would zigzag hundreds of miles back and forth through one of the deadliest winters in decades, using some of the worst transportation available. 11 days into the tour, and they were already on their fifth bus, and several members of the band soon developed flu-like symptoms, and the drummer had to leave the tour because of frostbite on his feet. By the time the tour had made it to Clear Lake, Iowa, Buddy needed some rest. So after the show on February 2nd, he decided to charter a small plane to fly himself and his band members Tommy Allsup and Waylon Jennings to Fargo, North Dakota for the next show. The cost for the tickets was only $36 a person. Just prior to the flight, 17-year-old Ritchie Valens challenged Tommy Allsup for his seat on the plane and won with the toss of a coin. Additionally, 28-year-old JP the Big Bopper Richardson was allegedly coming down with the flu and he needed to see a doctor, so Waylon Jennings gave up his seat as well. Supposedly after hearing about the seat switch, Buddy Holly told Waylon, "I hope your old bus freezes up," and Waylon jokingly replied, "Well, I hope your old plane crashes," words that would go on to haunt him for the rest of his life. The aircraft they were flying was a 1945 Beechcraft 35 V-tail Bonanza. Now, this was a relatively small aircraft with just enough room for the 3 passengers and the pilot. And despite the cramped quarters, the aircraft was within the limits for weight and balance for the flight. According to the investigation, the engine only had about 40 hours on it since the last major overhaul, and the maintenance record showed that everything was in order. Despite the damage sustained in the crash, the investigators were able to determine that there was no fire prior to the crash and no evidence of a structural failure or any problems with the flight controls. The landing gear was retracted and the engine was working normally at the time of the crash, so it was easy to rule out the possibility of an engine failure and a forced landing that had gone wrong. The aircraft was owned by Dwyer Flying Services, and one of the best clues the investigators had was from the owner of the company, Mr. Hubert Dwyer. Just before 1 a.m. on the day of the crash, Mr. Dwyer waved goodbye to the pilot and passengers, and he watched the aircraft take off to the south. He witnessed the plane climb to around 800 feet and then make a left-hand turn to the northwest. Shortly thereafter, the aircraft taillight was seen gradually descending into the distance until it was out of view. Mr. Dwyer immediately tried to contact the pilot on the radio, but he never got a response, and the wreckage would be found the next morning. The important thing that you need to know about Mr. Dwyer was that he was also a licensed commercial pilot and he was more than capable of conducting the flight himself. However, he turned over that responsibility to someone else. 21-year-old Roger Peterson was the pilot in command for the flight. Roger began flying when he was only 17 years old, and in the course of just 4 years, he had already acquired over 700 hours of flight time as he was working very aggressively towards his goal of becoming an airline pilot. Roger was also a flight instructor, and he had a commercial rating that allowed him to fly private charter aircraft for Dwyer Flying Services. Roger had been working for Mr. Dwyer for about a year, during which he accumulated about 128 hours flying various Bonanza aircraft. However, no one knows how many hours he had in the accident aircraft. Regardless, Mr. Dwyer spoke very highly of Roger, and he completely trusted him to conduct the flight. That being said, Roger had 2 big problems. The first was that because the flight didn't take off until 1 a.m., that meant, according to some reports, that Roger had been awake for over 17 hours at the time they crashed. So my guess is that fatigue was probably a contributing factor. Now this wasn't discussed in the investigation report, but that's most likely because the effects of fatigue on pilots weren't really understood that well back in 1959. The second big problem for Roger was that even though he was a licensed commercial pilot and legal to fly passengers, he wasn't authorized to fly in the weather. Now that's because even though he passed his instrument written exam, he failed his instrument check ride about 9 months prior to the crash. According to his logbook, at the time of the crash, he only had about 52 hours of instrument time, and none of that training had been done in the accident aircraft. Now that means the flight needed to be conducted under visual flight rules, or VFR, meaning Roger needed to stay out of the clouds, and he needed to be able to see where he was going and see the ground, and that brings us to the weather. At 5:30 p.m., about 7 hours before the crash, Roger Peterson walked into the air traffic communication station to get the first weather briefing for the flight. He was told that the weather at his destination and along his route of flight were reporting ceilings of 5,000 feet or better and at least 10 miles of visibility. This meant he was going to be legal to conduct the flight VFR staying below the clouds. But the only other issue was there was a possibility for light snow showers at the destination around 2 a.m. Now, in my opinion, one of the best things that Roger did with this information was later in that evening around 10 p.m. and again at 11:20 p.m., he called back to the weather shop to get another update. During that second call, he was told that the visibility was still 10 miles or greater, the local ceiling was 6,000 feet, but the ceilings along the route and at the destination had dropped down to 4,200 feet. For his final weather check, just a few minutes before midnight, Roger and Mr. Dwyer walked over to the weather shop to actually get a face-to-face update on the weather conditions. And you have to remember that back in 1959, weather radar was still a new concept. You couldn't get real-time updates like you can today, so I think they were doing everything right by trying to get an accurate understanding of what the weather was doing. During that final briefing, Roger and Mr. Dwyer were told that the local ceiling was now 5,000 feet, light snow was falling, and the pressure was dropping rapidly. What this meant was that the weather was deteriorating, and my guess is that Roger kept checking the weather because he probably knew that, but he also probably felt a lot of pressure to get the 3 rock and roll stars to their next show, and maybe that's why he had Mr. Dwyer go with him to that final weather briefing, perhaps hoping that he would cancel the flight. However, the briefing they received reflected VFR conditions for the entire flight. The only problem was that about 20 minutes before they walked in to get that weather brief, the U.S. Weather Bureau had issued a flash advisory for the area. Now, these are issued when hazardous weather is likely imminent or already occurring. This particular advisory said there was a band of snow 100 miles wide heading towards them from the north and blocking their route of travel. The weather system was reducing visibility to less than 2 miles, with surface winds gusting as high as 45 knots. Unfortunately, the weather briefers didn't tell anyone about this, so Roger had no idea of the danger he was about to encounter. The passengers showed up at the airport around 12:40 a.m. and loaded their bags. Roger told Mr. Dwyer that he would activate his flight plan as soon as he got airborne, and then he waved goodbye and taxied out for takeoff. During his taxi, Roger got on the radio and actually called the weather shop one more time for a final weather check. He was told that nothing had really changed other than the local ceiling was now down to 3,000 feet and the visibility had dropped to 6 miles because of snow. What the weather briefer didn't tell Roger was that a second flash advisory had been issued at 15 minutes after midnight, advising that the weather system was much bigger, now extending all the way down into Kansas and covering most of Iowa. The system had moderate to heavy icing in the clouds and generally worsening conditions. Without this key piece of information, Roger assumed it was going to be VFR for the entire flight, and he took off at 12:55 a.m. Mr. Dwyer watched the aircraft turn and depart to the north. Roger never made any radio calls, and Mr. Dwyer had to wait until sunrise before he could hop in a plane and begin the search. The aircraft was discovered around 9:30 a.m., about 6 miles from the airport, in an open field with about 4 inches of snow covering the wreckage. The investigation determined that the right wingtip initially made contact with the ground, while the aircraft was in a steep right bank descending at about 3,000 feet per minute. Roger was found in the cockpit, but all 3 passengers had been ejected from the aircraft upon impact and died instantly. The real question is, why did they crash? One of the things that we haven't talked about is that this was in a very rural part of Iowa, and back in 1959 there wouldn't be a lot of lights on the ground to help orient a pilot flying at night. If you combine that with an overcast ceiling that's blocking out the moonlight, and you add in some falling snow, then you can easily find yourself in an environment that's pretty pitch black without any reference to the horizon. This means it can be very easy to get spatially disoriented, and you have to rely on your instruments to fly, and that's why perhaps the most shocking part of this investigation was what they found inside the aircraft at the crash site. The first shocking discovery was that the aircraft was equipped with a Lear autopilot system, but because it had only been recently installed, it wasn't operable, and perhaps if it had been, then this tragedy could have been avoided. The second shocking discovery was what they saw on the instrument panel in the aircraft. The one important detail I didn't mention earlier about Roger's instrument training was that all of his instrument flight time was in an aircraft equipped with the standard type of attitude indicator, similar to what's found in most aircraft today. The blue part represents the sky, and the brown or the black part represents the ground. This makes it very easy for pilots to quickly orient themselves and understand which way is up. Unfortunately, the attitude indicator in the aircraft that Roger was flying was an outdated Sperry F3 gyro indicator. I'm sure you can immediately recognize the problem. This instrument was the exact opposite of what he had trained on, and it's highly likely that when Roger tried to rely on this, he misinterpreted what the aircraft was doing. Ultimately, the investigation blamed Roger for the crash, saying he never should have flown that night since he didn't have an instrument rating, and technically Dwyer Flying Services wasn't authorized as a charter company to conduct IFR flights either. The investigation would go on to say that Roger should have recognized the worsening weather conditions even without the knowledge of the weather flash advisories. However, I think Mr. Dwyer shares some of that responsibility as the owner overseeing the flight with a lot more experience than Roger. Overall, this was a terrible tragedy, but the lessons that we've learned from this are still just as valid today. And if you learned something from this debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.